The morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport was brisk, the air filled with a mix of anticipation and the controlled chaos typical of a fully booked flight. Travelers moved through the terminal in waves, some juggling coffee cups and carry-on bags, others shepherding restless children toward their gates. The crowd waiting for Flight 247 to Newark was no different. Professionals scrolling through their phones, families chatting softly, and individuals lost in their own thoughts as the boarding process began. Among them was a young man seated in first class, his tall frame folded comfortably into the plush seat near the window. Barron Trump, now a teenager standing well over 6 feet tall, was not an unfamiliar face to the world, though he had largely avoided the public spotlight. His reserved demeanor and preference for privacy made him something of an enigma, even to those who followed the news closely. As he flipped through the pages of a thick hardcover book, passengers who recognized him exchanged subtle glances, some nudging their companions and whispering in hushed tones. Despite the attention, Barron seemed unfazed, focused entirely on the book in his hands. Across the aisle, a different kind of attention was being drawn. An elderly man in his late 70s shuffled toward the rear of the plane, clutching a weathered leather duffel bag. His military jacket, adorned with faded patches and medals, told a silent story of service and sacrifice. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, and his steps deliberate. As he moved through the narrow aisle, passengers took notice. Some offered admiring nods, while others whispered among themselves, wondering about the man's history. The elderly veteran eventually reached his assigned seat near the back of the plane. It was wedged between a chatty businessman, whose voice carried over the hum of the cabin, and a restless toddler who was already squirming in her mother's arms. The veteran placed his duffel bag beneath the seat in front of him and settled in with quiet dignity. But moments later, tension rippled through the cabin as his seatmate grew visibly upset, complaining loudly to a flight attendant about needing a different arrangement. The veteran, ever polite, apologized for the inconvenience, though it was clear he was unsure of how to resolve the situation. His quiet attempts to mediate were drowned out by the businessman's insistent tone. The commotion drew the attention of passengers nearby, their gazes flickering between the two men. In first class, Barron Trump glanced up from his book, his brow furrowing as he observed the scene unfolding toward the rear of the plane. The raised voices contrasted sharply with the usual hum of pre-flight preparations. Leaning slightly into the aisle, he seemed to assess the situation, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, Barron reached up and pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When the uniformed woman arrived, her polite demeanor shifted to one of mild surprise as Barron softly made his request. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Her eyes darted toward the rear of the plane, where the veteran sat, and then back to Barron. It was an unusual request, especially coming from a teenager seated in first class. "Let me check," she replied, her tone tinged with both curiosity and admiration as she moved quickly toward the back. The murmurs in first class grew louder. Passengers who had been absorbed in newspapers or scrolling through tablets now glanced over their shoulders, intrigued by the young man's unexpected offer. A woman seated across the aisle leaned toward him, her voice low but insistent. "You don't have to do that, you know. You paid for this seat," she said, her confusion evident. Barron simply smiled and shrugged, his tone as unassuming as his gesture. "Some people deserve it more," he replied. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, her expression a mixture of disbelief and respect. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice carrying a slight tremble. Acts of kindness like this weren't something she encountered every day, let alone from someone so young. Barron nodded, his polite smile unwavering as he stood to retrieve his carry-on bag. The murmurs in first class grew into a low buzz, passengers craning their necks to watch as the tall teenager maneuvered into the aisle. A few even reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos of the unexpected scene. As Barron made his way down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane, whispers followed him. Passengers nudged each other, pointing discreetly as he passed. Some recognized his name, while others were simply moved by the gesture, marveling at the rarity of someone willingly giving up such a coveted seat. When he reached the veteran's row, the elderly man looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice weathered but steady. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron replied simply, extending his hand. "Thank you for your service. Please take my seat." The veteran hesitated, as if debating whether to accept the offer. But the sincerity in Barron's voice and the kindness in his eyes left no room for doubt. Slowly, the veteran stood, shaking Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's mighty kind of you." As the veteran made his way toward first class, the murmurs among passengers grew louder, a ripple of awe spreading through the cabin. A young mother in row 15 leaned toward her teenage daughter, whispering, "Did you see that?" He just gave up his seat. The businessman who had been seated next to the veteran glanced over, raising an eyebrow in surprise. "Never seen anything like that on a flight," he muttered to himself. Barron slid into the now vacant economy seat, adjusting his tall frame to fit the tighter space. He seemed completely at ease, ignoring the scattered stares and subtle glances from fellow passengers. When a flight attendant passed by, discreetly offering to bring him something to make him more comfortable, he simply shook his head and reopened his book, resuming his quiet reading. In first class, the veteran settled into the plush seat, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the armrest. A flight attendant approached him with a complimentary drink and a warm blanket, explaining softly, "The young man said you should have this seat." The veteran smiled faintly, his voice barely audible as he murmured, "It's been years since I've been treated like this." He glanced toward the back of the plane, his eyes searching for Barron. Though the young man was now absorbed in his book, his gesture had already transformed the tone of the entire flight. What began as a simple act of kindness had set the stage for something far greater, though no one on board could have anticipated what was about to unfold. The plane climbed steadily into the sky, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin as it leveled off at cruising altitude. The flight attendants began their routine, moving through the aisles with carts of drinks and snacks, but there was a different energy on board Flight 247. The mood had shifted from the usual pre-flight monotony to something more poignant. Passengers were still whispering about what had just occurred, a teenager willingly giving up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran. The act, simple yet profound, had sparked a quiet sense of admiration among those who had witnessed it. In first class, the elderly veteran sat silently, his gaze fixed out of the window. The warm blanket offered by the flight attendant rested across his lap, and his hands, though weathered with age, gripped the edges of his armrest. His thoughts seemed far away, the faintest tremor visible in his fingers as he sipped water from a plastic cup. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes sat next to him, her curiosity evident as she stole occasional glances at her seatmate. Finally, unable to contain herself any longer, she broke the silence. "That was quite a gesture," she said softly, her tone warm but curious. "Not something you see every day." The veteran turned to her, his expression softening. "It was," he replied, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a man who had lived through many stories. "But it's not just the gesture that's remarkable, it's who made it." The woman tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" The veteran adjusted a small pin on his lapel, a purple heart gleaming faintly in the cabin light. He sighed deeply as though weighing his words. "That young man," he began, "his family. They have a history of kindness, and in my case, it's personal." The woman's brow furrowed. "Personal?" The veteran nodded, leaning back into his seat. His voice grew steadier, stronger, as he began to tell his story. "It was a long time ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, fighting battles I didn't fully understand. I was injured, shot twice in the leg, and when I finally made it stateside, I thought my troubles were over. But coming home wasn't easy. There wasn't much waiting for me. No family to greet me, no job to return to. I was lost, just another soldier trying to piece my life back together. He paused, his gaze drifting back to the window as though replaying the memories in his mind. I ended up in New York City, trying to find work, trying to find my place. But nothing came easy. I didn't have a roof over my head, barely had enough to eat. One day, while I was sitting outside a diner, a man approached me. He was well-dressed, but not in a way that felt out of reach, just decent. He could have walked right past me like everyone else did, but he didn't. He stopped, asked me if I was okay. The woman leaned in closer, her curiosity turning to genuine concern. What happened? The veteran's lips curled into a faint smile, tinged with nostalgia. He sat with me, listened to my story, and then he did something I'll never forget. He gave me his card and told me to come to his office the next day. That man was Fred Trump. Gasps rippled through the small cluster of passengers in first class who had been subtly listening to the conversation. The woman's eyes widened. Fred Trump? As in? The veteran nodded, cutting her off gently. Donald Trump's father, Barron Trump's grandfather. The weight of his words lingered in the air. The veteran continued, his voice thick with emotion. Fred didn't owe me anything, but he made sure I had a place to stay and a job to get back on my feet. He didn't ask for anything in return, just told me, "You served this country. It's the least we can do." I've carried those words with me ever since. By now, several passengers in first class were openly listening, their conversations forgotten. The story rippled through the cabin, carried in whispers from seat to seat, until even those in the economy section began to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. In the back of the plane, Barron Trump remained unaware of the buzz, engrossed in his book, as if nothing unusual had happened. His tall frame was folded awkwardly into the tight seat, but he didn't seem to mind. Occasionally, a passenger would glance his way, their expressions a mixture of awe and gratitude. Back in first class, the veteran's voice grew steadier as he continued. I always wanted to thank Fred for what he did, but life got in the way. I never got the chance. And then, today, his grandson. That young man, he gave me a gift I'll never forget. The woman next to him placed a hand over her heart, visibly moved. "That's incredible," she murmured. "The odds of something like this happening." "Unbelievable," the veteran agreed, his eyes misting with gratitude. "It's as if fate stepped in to bring things full circle." A nearby passenger, a man in his early 40s with a tired but approachable face, couldn't hold back any longer. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam, too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people cared enough to help. What Fred Trump did for you? That's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's the little things," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over. But that man's generosity gave me a second chance. And today, his grandson reminded me of that all over again." As the conversations unfolded, the passengers in first class seemed drawn together by an invisible thread of shared humanity. Even those who had initially been indifferent now found themselves leaning in, captivated by the story and its unexpected connection to the young man seated in the back. A young mother, cradling her sleeping toddler, chimed in from across the aisle. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always believed in passing kindness forward. When someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pay it forward. It's like a chain reaction. The veteran smiled, his expression softening. Your dad was right, he said. And that's what today has reminded me. It's not about grand gestures. Sometimes just being seen, just being acknowledged, can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me. And now, his grandson has done the same. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively, as if the weight of the veteran's words had touched everyone on board. The quiet hum of the plane returned, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. In the back, Barron remained unaware of the ripple effect his simple act of kindness had created. But for the passengers in first class, the story was only beginning to unfold. As the plane continued its journey toward Newark, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly reflective. Conversations among passengers carried a newfound warmth, as though the simple act of kindness they had witnessed, and the story that followed, had sparked something deeper within each of them. The buzz in first class was unmistakable, with many now openly sharing their own stories of gratitude, resilience, and unexpected acts of compassion. The veteran, seated in first class with the blanket draped across his lap, found himself at the center of it all. Though he spoke with a quiet humility, his words carried weight, each one pulling listeners closer into his orbit. The story of Fred Trump's generosity had already rippled through the rows, but the veteran's reflections seemed to resonate even more deeply. Nearby, a flight attendant who had been quietly listening approached the veteran with a tentative smile. "Would you like me to let the young man know what you've shared about his grandfather?" she asked softly, her voice careful not to disturb the moment. The veteran hesitated, his weathered hands resting on the armrests. "Not yet," he replied after a pause. "Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." The flight attendant nodded, visibly moved by his response, and stepped away. But the story had already spread far beyond first class. In the economy section, passengers were subtly glancing back toward Barron Trump, whose tall frame still seemed out of place in the cramped seat. He remained oblivious to the attention, his focus firmly on the book in his hands, though the occasional whispered exchange from nearby rows did not go unnoticed. It wasn't until the plane hit a patch of turbulence that the quiet moment was briefly disrupted. The cabin jolted slightly, eliciting gasps and nervous chuckles, but the mood quickly settled back into a sense of calm. The turbulence, however, seemed to stir something in the veteran. He adjusted the Purple Heart on his lapel, his gaze distant but contemplative, before turning back to the middle-aged woman seated next to him. "You know," he began, his voice steady but softer now. "Gratitude doesn't stop with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others. It's funny how life works, isn't it? Decades later, his grandson reminds me of that mission." The woman smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's incredible how kindness has a way of circling back," she said, "even when you least expect it." As the plane began its descent into Newark, the final announcement from the captain seemed to pull everyone out of their reflections. The hum of activity returned as passengers prepared for landing, yet the conversations in first class quieted, the veteran's story lingering in the air like a shared secret. Still, no one could have predicted what was about to happen next. The flight attendant, moved by the veteran's words and the weight of the moment, decided to act. Making her way toward the back of the plane, she approached Barron Trump with careful steps, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the engines. "I thought you might want to know something." Barron looked up from his book, his brow furrowed slightly in curiosity. "Sure," he replied, his tone calm but intrigued. The flight attendant hesitated, searching for the right words. "The gentleman you gave your seat to, he shared something extraordinary about your family," she began. "Years ago, when he was at his lowest point, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him, gave him a place to live, and a job to get back on his feet. He said that today, your act of kindness reminded him of that moment and of the impact it had on his life. Barron's expression shifted, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He leaned back slightly, the book in his hands forgotten. After a moment, he simply said, "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It is," she replied. "I thought you should know." As the plane touched down and rolled toward the gate, the veteran, now aware that the story had reached Barron, decided to take one final step. Standing with quiet determination, he gathered his belongings and walked toward the back of the plane, his eyes scanning the rows until they found Barron. The young man, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in surprise as the veteran approached. The cabin grew silent, passengers pausing in their movements to watch the unexpected encounter. The veteran extended his hand, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Young man," he began, "I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought me full circle. Your family has a history of kindness, and you've carried that forward. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron shook the man's hand firmly, his voice quiet but resolute. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The exchange, though brief, left the cabin in awe. Some passengers wiped away tears, while others exchanged thoughtful glances. The connection between the two men, generations apart, felt like a living testament to the power of empathy and gratitude. The moment seemed to encapsulate everything the flight had come to represent: the profound impact of small, selfless acts. As the passengers began to disembark, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture. Some offered the veteran handshakes and words of gratitude for his service. The mood at the gate was unlike anything anyone had experienced on a flight before, an unspoken sense of unity, as though everyone on board had been touched by the same invisible thread. The veteran, about to leave, turned back one last time, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son," he said. "Don't ever lose that." Barron nodded, his usual reserved demeanor softening just enough to show the impact of the words. As he walked toward baggage claim, he pulled out his phone and typed a brief message. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he hit send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today." The journey on Flight 247 ended not just as a routine trip, but as an unforgettable moment that reminded everyone of the enduring power of kindness, gratitude, and the unexpected ways lives can connect. For those who witnessed it, the story of a small act of generosity had become a profound testament to the legacy of compassion and its ability to ripple far beyond its moment.